Right. This is quite a short webinar, so I'm going to rush through this at quite a pace. Okay. Um, Now, no matter how popular and busy your libraries are, there are always some students who never enter voluntarily. You, you might see them in library lessons or if they're brought in with departmental lessons, but outside of these, they could be invisible. They could not be part of your school community. So the question we need to ask ourselves, and what I'm going to get you to consider today, is why don't these students come into the library? I'm sure you all must be aware that this year is a National Year of Reading. You can hardly miss it, really. Um, and the focus, this is the third National Year of Reading that we've had, and the focus this year is on reading for pleasure. But reading for pleasure does not happen by accident. It's enabled by environment, by representation, and a sense of belonging. A warm, welcoming, and inclusive school library. We know many students read their own books. I used to love it when students came in with their own books because they introduced me to authors I had not discovered. You know, how did that miss my radar? Um, and also, it was lovely to chat to them about why they picked it and would they recommend it and do they think I should get it for the library. But we also want students to read our library resources because if they don't, what is the point of having them there? They're going to sit gathering dust. If they're going to read these resources, though, that we've got in our library, they must first choose to enter the library. And if we want them to enter it, then they must feel seen, represented, safe, and welcome. So why does reading for pleasure matter so much? I'm sure you know all of these. There's a huge number of benefits backed up by a large body of research, some of it going back several years. But I think it's worth reminding ourselves of these, especially this year, because then if anyone says to you, why have we got a National Year of Reading? What's all this fuss about reading for pleasure? We've actually got some answers to give them. Students who read for pleasure show increased attainment across all subjects. This makes sense if you think about it, because you need to be able to read to access the curriculum, to understand and answer exam and test questions. Reading also increases vocabulary growth. Studies show that books have around 50% more rare words than prime time TV or written media. And this increase in vocabulary has an impact on attainment over time. Reading for pleasure also builds general knowledge. I think students today lack general knowledge about the world and the environment they live in. I have picked up so many random facts from reading. One day it's going to be the winning quiz question that I'll be able to answer from one of these random facts. But what reading has also done is sparked a curiosity for me to find out more about the situation a story setting, whether that's a period of history I know nothing about, or a country that I've never visited, or traditions that I wasn't aware of. It just sparks that curiosity in me. And I think without reading for pleasure, without that reading, children are losing that curiosity about the world that they live in. Reading for pleasure also increases comprehension. Now, there's a symbiotic relationship here because students need to understand what they're reading to enjoy it. But at the same time, we want them to read a book that maybe increases their comprehension a bit more, that pushes and challenges them. But there has to be a balance because if they don't understand what they're reading, they won't enjoy it. It won't make any sense to them. And I really think this is why so many students don't engage with what we consider classics. There are too many outdated concepts and words they don't understand. I mean, for example, if you say to a student, what's a mantelpiece? If they haven't got a fire at home with a mantelpiece, they won't have a clue what it is because it's not a word that's generally used in conversation. Now, this increase in vocabulary and comprehension improve literacy skills needed not just for English but other subjects. So we've got that link back to attainment. Well-being and empathy, this is well known, isn't it? Reading reduces stress. You only have to read for a few minutes for your blood pressures to go down. But it also helps students cope with emotional problems, to understand difficult situations. And reading about different perspectives builds their cultural understanding and empathy, something we need in society desperately today. I also think that if you can get students to read, if they're sitting and picking up a book and reading, they're actually spending less time on screens. And this results in positive health related behaviours. So, good news all around. The last thing that I think about reading for pleasure and why we should encourage it is because we live in a world where things are rapidly changing. They change so much, don't they? It used to be like every 5, 6 years. Now it's almost every year or so we have advances in technology. Children today may not end up working in jobs that are out there that are not yet available. And even if they enter a traditional career, this likely will change over time. Now, we cannot teach them skills that they might need because we don't have a clue what they are. So we have to generate uh, children, students that have the ability to learn and adapt throughout their lives, to recognise the value of continuing professional development and apply it to their situation. And reading for pleasure engenders those lifelong learning habits needed for this. But the important thing is you cannot force people to read for pleasure. You can only create conditions needed to cultivate it. I have had students in library lessons, and I know they're not reading because they don't turn the pages of the book. They will sit for 20 minutes, half an hour, daydreaming, looking out of the window. That's fine. Daydreaming's good. You know, I sit and daydream, look out the window. But they do it every library lesson, and that's not really not what we want them to do, is it? So we need to think about the conditions that we have to have in place to read for pleasure. I've mentioned these factors last week, so if anyone was at that webinar, then I'm going to apologise if you're hearing it again, although I only really spoke about the first three last week. Now, the first condition is books. You cannot read if you don't have any reading materials. This is so obvious, but people don't seem to understand this. You know, you have to fund libraries so they can buy resources so that your students have something to read. Now, I said books, but it could be comics, it could be magazines, it could be anything. I use books as a generic term, the same way I talk about school libraries and school librarians. You also need enough for your student body. You know, you can't just have a few books on a shelf. There's no longer recommended numbers, but guidelines used to be that if you were a primary school, you had 10 to 15 books per student, and if you were a secondary, it was 13 to 18, with 17 to 25 books per sixth form student. Now, if you're in a large school of around, let's say, 1,500 students, which is not unusual these days, and you say let's have an average books of, an average number of books per student of around 16, you are looking at 24,000 books, which is a huge number. And these guidelines, these numbers of books were suggested before the growth in online resources, which I think have sort of muddied the water. Because if you have an online encyclopedia that every single one of your students can access, does that count as 1,500 resources? You see, it gets all a bit messy and hard to count. So I think it's very difficult to put a number on that recommendation of resources we should have. I will say though that however many books you have, quality is more important than quantity. We could easily fill our libraries with hordes of books that we've gathered from car boot sales and charity shops and those book swap places in supermarkets and doctor surgeries and things. However, these are unlikely to be what students want to read, and that is a really important factor in reading for pleasure. We need rich, relevant and up-to-date collections in school libraries. Students have to be able to access those resources, and there are two aspects to this. The first is physical access. This means the library being open when students can visit. Now, many schools have short breaks. They don't often have those hour-long breaks these days. It's usually 25 minutes. My last school was 2 lots of 25 minutes break and then lunchtime. The students want to get food, they want to go to the toilet, maybe they need to see a teacher, chat to friends, maybe they just want to go outside and get some fresh air and kick a football around. So libraries really need to open before and after the school day. And schools that are employing librarians for just those school hours that the school is open are restricting access to the library. Now, I know some people say, oh, but you can get access through your library lessons and during the day. But these only really happen in Key Stage 3 if you're lucky. And then they don't usually carry on till year 9, they year 7 and 8. But what about your older students? When can they access your library? You know, your Key Stage 4 that have got a full timetable, because this group are less likely to visit at break times, as we know. Now, the other aspect of access is intellectual access, which covers things like different formats and representative stock. I'm going to talk more about that shortly. Time. Students need time in the library. They need time to browse, to linger, to pick something up and abandon it if they don't like the look of it. I've had English teachers bring a class down, usually unannounced. I'm busy cataloguing, you know, big pile of books, and all these students come in, 25 of them. And the teacher said they've come to change their library book. And she said, you've got 5 minutes to choose a book. So it's like slight chaos, panic with some of them. I can't help them because I'm too busy at the desk issuing books, returning books. I see students grab the nearest book, often one that's on display, because it's easier than choosing something from the shelves. Now, the readers are fine. They will know what they're looking for. It's your non-readers, your students who don't like reading, who haven't discovered what type of reader they are yet. Those are the ones that will struggle with choosing something quickly. And those are the ones that will just grab the nearest book. Okay. They take it away to their lesson, fine. They'll read a few pages, but then they generally bring it back. And I think, well, what is the point of that? What is the point? I do wonder how many students have read the few pages of like dozens of books throughout their lifetime and never actually read a whole story. Now, sure, that's increased my loan statistics, really good for me, but it does mean more work for me with issuing and putting it back on the shelf and things. So we need to make sure we build in time for these students to come to the library and to just browse the same way we browse in bookshops, and if we go into public libraries we browse. We rarely just pop in, grab something and leave, do we? Talking about choice, if you want students to read for pleasure, they must have the right to choose what to read. Okay? It's not what adults think they should be reading. It's not your favourite book. There's nothing wrong with trying to tempt them, and I've tried that several times. I've been successful occasionally. It's not what is levelled or approved or convenient. Okay? It's their choice of what to read. Okay? And this choice feeds back into books, because you need to have enough for students to choose from. If you have a limited collection, it really doesn't give them much choice, does it? And the final condition, and I think one of the most important, is guidance. To create the best conditions for reading for pleasure, students need a knowledgeable adult who knows the collection, who knows the student, who can give personal recommendations and validate their preferences. Now, most of the time, this is not their English teacher. They might know the students, but they don't know the school library collection as well as you do. They also tend not to have such a wide range of book knowledge. So this person, this knowledgeable adult in the library is you, the school librarian. This is part of our job, or at least part of our job. So remove any one of these factors and reading for pleasure is weakened. Remove several and it collapses. So you can see why If schools don't fund libraries so they can purchase new books, if they don't have library lessons built into the timetable so students don't have access and time to go into the library, and if they limit library opening hours, you will get less reading for pleasure automatically. So what do students read? What makes them pick up a book and read it? Several reasons. First of all, students will read what is relevant, what is connected to their lived experience. They are more likely to pick up a book when it links to their culture or heritage, their community, their family structures, interests, the issues they are navigating in their lives at that moment. Relevant also means contemporary. Books with current voices using modern language and exploring themes that resonate now. If students never see their reality reflected in books, they may well consider reading is something that other people do. And this is tied in with the school demographics. Affirmation is deeper than relevance because it validates who you are. Affirming collections include ethnically diverse, disabled, neurodiverse, LGBTQ plus characters that are visible in everyday stories. No stereotyping, no single story narratives, and not all issues books. You don't want every book with Jewish characters to be about the Holocaust. When students see themselves positively represented, reading becomes an act of recognition. And for students outside of these identities, affirmation builds empathy. Now, I think the third factor, reading for pleasure because something's interesting, is often underestimated. The majority of people, students and adults alike, will probably only read for pleasure something that interests them. If you, why would you read something if you're not interested? Why would you, if you're reading for pleasure, if you want to chill out at the end of the day and you want to read something that gives you pleasure, you're not going to pick up something that you're not interested in or you don't enjoy. You know, it's the opposite of reading for pleasure, isn't it? They may read something connected with their work or studies, but if they don't like the subject, they're unlikely to read beyond what they have to. So think about how many sixth formers don't undertake that wider reading around their subject. Yet when they do, when they're interested in it and they enjoy it and want to read more about it, it's really obvious in their deeper understanding and their written work. If we want to encourage voluntary reading and reading for pleasure, we need to prioritise engagement, which means knowing their interest and prioritising this above measurement. This means knowing trends, what's popular on BookTok or whatever social media platform is currently popular, what circulates in your library, what bookshops are selling, what's top of the list. Listen to informal book chats. You know, what are the readers in your library talking about? You know, are they books that you don't have in your library? Okay. Now, I've mentioned accessibility, being able to get into the library as an important factor in reading for pleasure. Cognitive access is also important. Students will not read your books if they're too difficult, if they're linguistically inaccessible. And sometimes they don't like them when they're visually overwhelming. I know some students like books that are full of stuff happening all over the page, but not every student does. Some students like it to be quite linear, you know, a picture, information, fact, picture. So students won't read if the books are too difficult. Right? Now, this doesn't mean simplified books. It means barrier free. So you need to ascertain what barriers are preventing your students from reading and remove as many of those as possible. And this means looking at formats such as dyslexia friendly books, graphic novels, verse novels, and such like. Being safe, this fifth on the list, is the foundation of reading for pleasure. Students will browse freely when they feel they won't be judged for their choices, when their identity is respected, and when they won't be mocked for reading. Okay? Your safe library will allow intellectual exploration. We all know our libraries are more than rooms with books. So many people do not understand this, which is why there's this misconception that anyone can run a school library because, hey, all you need to do is keep the shelves tidy, and maybe cover a few books and supervise at lunchtime. But it's not just a resource room. It's a human space that reinforces reading for pleasure and inclusion. Reading for pleasure is often portrayed as solitary, and okay, reading is a solitary activity most of the time, um, unless you're in a book group, but you go away and read separately. Like I know people read, they share books and read it aloud, but generally people's own reading, their reading for pleasure is very individual. But the desire to read is socially shaped. Students will read because their peers recommend books. They see others reading and they will talk about characters and share fandoms, and all of this makes them feel part of a reading community. A welcoming library supports this with book chat, book clubs, informal reading groups, using the student voice for recommendations, valuing different formats that generate shared interests. When all these are in place, reading is seen as something that is done together. Now, for some students, the library is their refuge, a necessary space. We all know who these students are. All of us in school libraries know these students. And this group, I feel, more than any others, are the ones who are severely impacted by the closure of their school library. Now, ironically, the library can be the calmest place in the school at break times for these students, even when it's also one of the busiest, which seems a total contradiction. But that's because it's a predictable environment. It gives students that break from playground politics. It's a safe sanctuary for the neurodiverse and LGBTQ plus students, and it's a haven for students with anxiety. And the important thing in all this is that it's managed by a trusted adult. A welcoming library is a place where these students find acceptance and belonging, where they find refuge. Libraries are one of the last places in a school where serendipity is possible. I must admit, serendipity is one of my favourite words. It's finding a book you didn't know you needed, exploring a new genre, encountering a different perspective, following curiosity rather than task. And it's one of the things I love about public libraries, that you can just go in and you can just dip into whatever books you want and take them home. And if you no, this wasn't quite what I thought it was going to be, you can just take them back. It's no problem. But now I know most departments have their own libraries, but these resources are linked to the subject. And classroom libraries in primary schools, by their nature, because they're small, have a limited range of formats, genres, and books at different reading levels. No departmental or classroom library can ever match what is on offer in a well-funded school library. So this discovery, which is often linked to reading for pleasure, can be encouraged with face-out displays, theme tables, cross-genre shelving, and diverse representation across the collection. And discovery also helps students to build their reading identity, an important aspect of becoming a reader. I'm sure most of you are aware of the Rudine Sims Bishop quote that books can be mirrors reflecting the reader or windows offering a different viewpoint. What mirrors do is validate identity, reduce isolation, and affirm belonging. Without these books, students may well feel marginalised or invisible. And books that are windows build empathy and challenge stereotypes, broadening understanding. So a welcoming library will have a balanced collection providing both aspects. So a couple of questions for you to think about. What messages is your library unintentionally communicating? Now, all of us will set up our libraries and will be sending out messages by displays and what we do in it. So step back and think about what messages does somebody get from this library who has never seen it before. And also think about your school community and who might feel implicitly welcomed and who might feel overlooked in your library? Is there a group that's maybe missing in your library? Okay. I've talked about students reading what is relevant to them, seeing themselves represented, but you can't create that diverse and inclusive collection if you don't know your school community demographics. I'm only going to touch briefly on these because doing a webinar that covers the school and collection audit actually is a lot longer. We don't have the time, but this is an important aspect of building that diverse and inclusive library. The first thing is ethnic and cultural demographics, which is statistical data based on shared characteristics. So it's things like shared history, traditions, values. In the UK, this data is grouped into 5 categories, but these are way too broad for the purposes of school and collection audits. For example, one category is Asian British. Now, if you think that covers a huge range of countries, India, Japan, China, Bangladesh, and more. And all of these will have different history, different traditions. So you can see how these 5 categories wouldn't work within the context of resource provision. You should also know what faiths are represented in your school. Socioeconomic influences. Is your school in a disadvantaged area? Do your students live in a disadvantaged area? Your school may not be in it, but are they bussed in from somewhere else? Now, studies show that families in disadvantaged areas have fewer books at home, so they have fewer possibilities to read. There's also likely to be a lack of public library provision as well. Parents may have lower literacy levels themselves, so they can't help with reading at home. So you need to be aware of the community your students live in. What languages do your students speak at home? This is not a homogenous group. Your EAL students, and you can't lump them all together. They may be fluent in speaking a language but can't read it. Others might be bilingual and can read and write in their home language, but their written English and reading English is quite poor. And these will have an impact on your resource provision and ultimately on reading for pleasure. If they only speak the home language and don't read it, you won't need books for them. But if their English is poor, you'll need dual language books that they can read. And this can be difficult because there's not much available. So you'll end up with a restricted choice and they are expensive. So another reason to fund school libraries. Do you know the SEND profiles of your students? They all have different needs. What is quite good though is that common strategies that you put into place, for example, using visual images as well as letters or numbers for shelf guides, are likely to be helpful to all. Your LGBTQ plus representation. You are unlikely to know the numbers of these students, but you will have students in your school that are LGBTQ plus, even if you don't know them. And finally, we need to think about our vulnerable groups, like looked after children, young carers, students that have had a family bereavement or that are struggling with mental health issues. They may not be vulnerable for their entire school life, but we still need to support them even if they're going through a difficult phase. Once you've gathered this information, you can use it to ensure you have a collection representative of your community, and a stock audit will help you identify the gaps. Now, when you're doing your stock audit, your priority should be your school community. So, for example, if you have a cohort of Asian girls in your schools, you might discover that you don't have many books with Asian girl characters in them. So that's a gap that you need to fill. But don't just stick to your school community. You need a wider societal representation. Because if you have a school that doesn't have a particularly diverse population, you need to expand your students' viewpoint. You need those books that are windows. Because these students, although they might live in a very small community, they will hopefully go out to university to work in the wider world and interact with people with very different perspectives to their own. Now, diversity is not a display for a particular month. Yes, these need to be part of your library environment, but diversity should be considered all year round. in every display and every book list. It should be embedded in your library collection and activities. I know this is not always possible. It's quite hard to do sometimes because there may not be books available, although the representation in books is better than it used to be. And if you're only doing a small list of books, it's quite difficult. You know, if you only want a list of 12 books, how do you cover different types of diversity, ethnicity, religions, neurodiversity? How do you put all of that into 12 books? So, yes, it can be difficult, but all I can say is try the best you can and don't always leave the same group out. Okay, if you find you're leaving a group out, maybe because you haven't got any resources that represent that group, seek out those resources for your library. Diversity is also not a bookcase of multicultural books. Okay, we do not have a shelf of white authors. We don't point to a bookcase and say, oh, these are our white male authors. So we shouldn't be pointing to a bookcase and saying, these are our ethnic minority female authors. Okay, you should incorporate your diverse books into the main collection because you need diverse authors and illustrators and characters across all your genres. You can identify aspects of diversity via list if you want to. You could have stories set in Africa or books with Muslim main characters, and make sure you use those keywords to help students find them. I always think more keywords are better because the more you can put in about a book, where it's set, what the characters are like, the um, the better use and accessibility you are giving to your collection because students will be able to find them. And when you're looking at your collection, don't forget to audit your images and watch out for stereotypes in books. And basically ask yourself if any one of your students walked into your library today, would they find themselves on your shelves? Now, to answer that, you need to know your students, and do you? Right, reading for pleasure thrives on, we've had the conditions. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about formats and types of books because I've talked about diversity and students being represented, but this is also an important aspect. Your readers, your students who love reading will already be engaging with books. They will be reading the award winners, the more challenging texts. What you need to look at is what's likely to attract your reluctant and non-readers to encourage them to read for pleasure. And again, this is not a homogenous group. You know, we do tend to talk of them like, oh, reluctant readers, but some won't read because they struggle with it, and hopefully they'll be getting interventions. Others can read, but they don't see the relevance of reading. They're not interested in it. They don't see how it relates to their lives. Or they may have had unsuccessful reading experiences and don't want to repeat this. And let's face it, if you do something and you fail at it or it's not very pleasant, you don't really do it again. Or you might do it once more and then you think, oh, I'm not doing this anymore. I really think that many people give up on reading for pleasure because they pick the wrong book and don't connect with it. And they do this time after time after time. And I do wonder if you wonder if there's an optimal number of times that people give reading for pleasure a try before they give up. So that would be quite an interesting piece of research. And I think this is why school librarians are important at connecting students with the right book before they reach that optimal number and decide, I'm not reading, I'm not a reader, don't like it. Now, generally, this list of books are the sort that tempt students and should be in your libraries, especially if you're focusing on reading for pleasure right now. The award winners can wait. So we've got your series fiction, which are an easy read because once you've read the first one in the series, you know the people, you know the characters, the relationships, and they're almost like a comfort read. Graphic novels and manga. These are hugely popular. I'm not keen on manga, so I always have to ask other librarians what to put in my library. But I do quite like graphic novels. But I don't know if you've ever tried to read one out loud. I tried one once with my daughter, and it was a nightmare. I didn't know what to read first. It's interesting how when you're just reading it instinctively, you sort of your eyes move around the page. But if you try to read it aloud, it's like, where do I go from here? Now, short books, okay, and I know this is a strange one, but some students find large books scary. Some students won't take a hardback. I used to have to convince some of my students that there was the same number of words in a hardback as a paperback because they thought that some of the words were cut out to make the paperback smaller. You know, I do get that there's a consideration of weight with some of these books though. High-low titles, lots available, much more than they used to be, and verse novels. I am absolutely in awe of how authors who write verse novels can convey so much in so few words. And I should have added actually diary format here as well. So I have another question, and it is not what should they read, but what will they read voluntarily. So think about what will your students read, because that is what you need to be focusing on. So, right, I want you to think about the high street. Right, are there any shops you don't go into because you don't feel you belong in them? There's definitely shops I don't go into, all sorts of reasons. Sometimes they're just too expensive. I look in the window and think, I'm not paying that for a pair of shoes, and go on to the next one. Sometimes it feels a little bit too high end or doesn't really fit in with my lifestyle. Or maybe there's nothing of interest to me in the shop, you know. Or sometimes it might be that I've had a bad shopping experience there. I bought something, it fell apart, and they weren't interested in giving me a refund. Now think of where you do feel you belong and why. What is it about the shops you like to go in and browse and where you feel comfortable in? I know always bookshops, you know, there's no problem there. But there are other places where I'm happy to have a look round and where I feel comfortable and not judged. And students are the same. They will come into your library and browse where they feel they belong and where they feel safe. But what do we mean by this, a safe space? Now, a lot of what I've already mentioned is relevant here, but there's emotional safety. Now, this is tied up with clear behaviour expectations, consistently applied rules, anti-bullying stances, and staff modelling inclusive language. If you think about it, students in secondary schools, I'm thinking here, they have lessons with different teachers. They come across lots of different teachers throughout their whole school day. And these teachers probably have different behaviour expectations. Some may be more lenient than others. So in a way, a student's almost never quite sure until they've really got to know that teacher what they're going to be doing is wrong. You know, in the library, they have the same staff there all the time. It's you. They know what your rules are. Okay. So this is what makes them feel emotionally safe in your library. Now, this photograph, this is one of my photos I've got here. This is one of my favourite photos I've ever taken in my library. A small class library lesson. They were spread all over. I was lucky I had quite a big library. They were on tables, soft chairs, bean bags. This boy took his shoes off. He's laid down. He's reading a graphic novel. And he's got a book. Well, I said he looks like he's using it for a pillow, but I suspect it was something he wanted to borrow that he didn't want anyone else to grab. But I just think, how safe must he have felt in the library to do that in front of all his peers in school? He just lay down, shoes off, reading. And I just think, you know, this is what we want all our students to feel, isn't it? As safe and as comfortable as that. Neurodiverse friendly spaces have a predictable and logical layout. As librarians, this is probably instinctive to us, but I've been into some libraries which have usually been put into place by other school staff and volunteers, and you've got picture books in one corner and then some under the window, and your fiction collection's all separated and it's not in any sort of order at all. It's an absolute mess, and I can see why neurodiverse students would struggle in an environment like that. Now, signage comes into play here. This is important, especially for neurodiverse students and those with visual disabilities. You need a sans serif font on a muted background like I've got on these slides, and don't laminate because the reflections make it difficult for some of them to read. And think about the colours you use. Okay, sometimes I've read things that have been pale colours on a pale background and they've really been difficult to read, especially from a distance. Zoning, another aspect to consider in your neurodiverse friendly space. Okay, I know it's a struggle, but we need to try and have quiet areas for those who want to read or who can't cope with too much noise or distractions, and then other areas where those who want a more social space can gather. Okay. And then the final thing really with neurodiverse friendly spaces is to think about sensory considerations such as noise from computers or photocopiers, because if you're in a quiet library and people are tapping away on computers, it actually can be quite noisy and distracting. I've covered several aspects of accessibility, so physical access, but think about clear pathways for your wheelchair users and any students who are using crutches, because they often end up in the library, don't they? And does your IT equipment have accessibility tools built in? And do you know how to use them so you can help your students? The final thing is resource limitation. Are there limitations on what you can stock? Have you had to remove items due to book challenges? Now, these are often LGBTQ plus titles, or maybe books addressing difficult issues. Does your management frown on non-traditional formats, such as graphic novels, so you tend not to buy them? Now, when we've had such challenges or know there's disapproval for certain books, we tend to self-censor what we buy. It's a natural reaction. If we remove resources, we're not protecting children and young people, we're reducing their intellectual access and their access to reading for pleasure. So basically, a censored library is a narrow window and it excludes the students who need it most. So leaving you with a few questions. Think about who is missing from your shelves. Okay, you will need to know your students for this and your stock. But who avoids your library? You probably know the groups that do this, but why? Do you know why they don't come into the library? It might be that they're not interested, but is there something you can tempt them with? What one change could you make that would make your space more welcoming to get those avoiders into your library? And what one collection change would lead to an increase in voluntary browsing? Now, the last two are quite difficult because how are you going to let those students who don't come into the library know that you might now have something of interest to them? So, reading for pleasure basically begins with belonging, that feeling of belonging. Belonging begins with representation in your resources. You can see yourself. And representation begins with informed library leadership. And this is where you, the school librarian, comes in. Thank you.